Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson in John's 15th chapter. We made it all the way up to the 16th verse, and we're going to take it from the 17th all the way to the end. It's 27 verses, so we'll be able to fit that in, but just to refresh your memory in case you haven't watched any of these videos on the Upper Room Discourses. These are the chapters of 14 through 16 in John's account, and they are unique to his account. They describe, so after the Last Supper, of which we read of in the 13th chapter, and then in the 18th comes the crucifixion. So in the night on the Passover, when he was arrested and betrayed, he also gave this unique dialogue to the 11 disciples. Judas was not in the midst because the last time we read of him is in 13:6, when the Savior identifies him as the traitor at the table and tells him to go do what you do. The disciples don't immediately intuit this, or the 11 that remained faithful. They were asking themselves out loud, could it be I, or who could it be among us that would do such a thing? And Judas reemerges in the 18th chapter. So he wasn't privy to this dialogue, and it is for the faithful and obedient saints, not just of his age, but of any age. So there's a lot of stuff in these three chapters. The 17th chapter, it also bears mention, is what is in a lot of ways a more accurately labeled Lord's Prayer than the script we're accustomed to calling such, Matthew 6, 9, 13. That is more, can be known as the disciples' prayer. For instance, the master himself would not need to ask for forgiveness, so it's more for us. But this is a communion between him and his Father. That's a dialogue in which, to give the Cliff Notes version, he prays for the same unity which is found between Father and Son to flourish on the church. But in the 15th chapter itself, we read of in the first 9 or 10 verses, the doctrine of union, which is expressed by the analogy of a vine. So the Father is the husbandman. This is the seventh and final I am statement, of which we read in John's account. He identifies himself as the vine and his Father the gardener, and we are the branches which draw our life from the vine. So he is the source of our life, and if we abide in him, then his power and presence and wisdom takes residence and in us and manifests through us. But the communion is completely contingent on this connection, and those who fail to bear fruit are fit for the fire, analogous to death, judgment, and hell. And then he also defines the greatest form of love as laying down the gifts for his friends. He knew he was going to do this within 24 hours. The disciples were slow to adjust to the reality that their beloved master would, in fact, be executed in little time passage, and he elevates them to friends, and that's a promotion from servants. So friendship is not born of necessity. There is no need for him to share friendship with us. He is wholly self-sufficient, just like there's no need for God to create the heavens and the earth. He doesn't need us, so they're both in acts of expression and love that he would exalt us. And and in the closing verse, of which we already covered, he establishes the fact that his election of us antedates our election of him. So before the foundation of earth, he knew the sheep who would know his name, and he would know their name. So the 17th verse reads, "These I commanded you, so that you love one another." And this ties into the 12th through the 13th verse that we're just going to read it out loud. "These I have spoken to you, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete." That's actually the 11th verse. "This is my command, that you love one another as I have loved you." So love is equated to a commandment. So why would he command us to love? And the reason is because he only wants what's best for us, and the best blessings in life are found in and can only come from love manifested. And he establishes in the 13th voice, he would soon practice what he preached by laying down his life. So love is more than an emotion. It's an action, and he expressed it for the entire world on the cross, shedding his blood to pay a penalty that was never his to pay. So that's what we want to understand what he means by love at this point. The word and terminology and concept of love abound throughout the writings of John, but there's a lot that we can say here outside of the 15th chapter, but we're not going to do that. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before you. So in this transition, he shifts from love to its antagonist, hate, and he all but virtually guarantees us that the world will hate us. Even though we are trying to make the world a better place, the world will resist our efforts and despise us and scorn us and ridicule us and not treat us as belonging to it. In some sense, we don't belong to the world. We are otherworldly creatures. We are spiritual beings operating in human environments. But as the disciple mimics the master, he was hated. He would be soon tied on the cross for that hatred. And if the one we call master, when we call ourselves our disciples, we have no right or reason not to expect to embrace what came from him. Certainly not to the same degree of severity, but if there was a cross in his life, there will be a cross in one form or another, however benign, however literal, in his disciples' life. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, yet I chose you out of the world. For that reason, the world hates you. So the world is not our natural homeland. We are pilgrims and aliens and strangers on it, in the words of Peter. And so they will reject us and vomit us out, and because we do not, strictly speaking, belong to it. The world is at war with God, who is trying to reconcile his enemies and turn them into friends. And so love of the world is also a dangerous a love we can cultivate, because love of the world can compromise or ultimately transcend the love of which we owe Elohim. He is to be the supreme object, in as much as he is the source of our love, so too must he be the supreme object, and we can't be man-pleasers, as Paul establishes in Galatians 1. We can be God-pleasers. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they shall persecute you too. If they have kept my word, they would keep yours too. So I often liken him to a royal prince, the consummate democrat, the king who shares his court with his people. So he elevates his disciples, that's to an equality with his masters, but once we realize what that equality entails, it really winnows out the weak. So as I mentioned earlier, if there was a cross in his life, we have no right or reason not to expect one of our own. And because the world persecuted him as they persecuted him, and he had warned the disciples, this was not a sudden or unexpected theme that they had not heard before. He warns them as early in the Sermon of the Mount, verses 10 and 11 of the 5th chapter, and also in several other locations, but that's probably the earliest one. So there is a continuity of expected persecution we read of in Matthew 10 when he sends out the 70 and the 12, and elsewhere, the Mount Olivet Discourse. It's really all over the place. So he wants us to know what we have signed up for. He's not promising an easier or more comfortable life, but one of pain, privation, and persecution. In as much as they inflicted it on him, so too will we, as the living continuation of his body on earth. The church is likened to the body of him. Cannot expect to bear the same burden of persecution. Not quite the same, but the fact that he endured so much and willingly and necessarily on our behalf makes any sacrifice we can give to him pale in comparison. But all this they shall do to you because of my name, because they do not know him who sent me. So in Matthew 5:11, he says, persecuted for my name's sake. Now, there's a difference between being persecuted for being Christian and just being insulted or retaliated upon because you're a jerk. And I think a lot of Christians tend to blur that confusion. They excuse their selfish or conceited behavior and attribute it to somehow being Christ-like or Christian. And there is a difference. But if we do bear the name, we also bear the reproach, we bear the stigma, we bear the burden of the defense for the honor and exaltation of that name, which is increasingly marginalized in the society and the world we live in. And and they will do this because they were estranged from him. Now, the earliest persecutions would have come from the Jews, and he says this in 16:2. He says that they will think they are doing a service to Elohim, and that was very much the case with the Apostle Paul. He had a zeal and an admirable energy, but even if the direction it wasn't deployed in that moment of time wasn't exactly admirable, the quality in itself was admirable. And once he got it reoriented, then he built the church he once tore down far larger or more extensively than perhaps anyone who came after him. But these Jews, their immediate persecutors, they would have been familiar with the scriptures. They would have been scriptorians and skilled wordsmiths as such, who could probably locate a verse to support their doctrines if asked for, or any argumentative context. But they did not know the one who was speaking through the scriptures. They did not have a relationship with the one whose relationship our salvation depends upon. Religion will not save you. Just going through the motions and the mechanical observances is insufficient for salvation. It has to be a living, dynamic encounter with the living and loving Elohim, who offers us friendship and relationship, again, not because he needed anything. He is wholly self-sufficient, but because he wants to. It's an expression of his love to share some of his essence with us unworthy creatures. If I had not come and spoken to them, they would have no sin, but now they have no excuse for their sin. So he came to convict and expose. He exposed the hypocrisy and the spiritual bankruptcy of the reigning religious orthodoxy that existed in Judea at the time. And he also when a Christian their sin is exposed and it finds them out, it convicts them in their conscience, and they have a genuine conviction, and the reaction of him who is hardened in his heart and dead in his trespasses and sin, well, they will not be even embarrassed or see any need to abandon it in the face of an awareness of it. Perhaps they know it's wrong, but if being wrong feels so right, why bother being right, as the hedonist and worldly and atheist outlooks and suggests. He who hates me hates my Father as well. Now his immediate religious antagonists, the Jews, would have professed themselves to be ardent children and disciples and promoters and protectors and proclaimers of Yahweh, yet they missed his message. In his midst, he had his Son speaking to them, who he sent to the lost sheep of Israel, because they were estranged from him, and they rejected him, and in so doing, they rejected the Father. The Father had tried to speak to them through several centuries, through prophets, we read in the opening chapter of Hebrews, but then he finally sent his Son himself as the supreme expression and embodiment of the divine nature and will, and they had rejected what he claimed he could, who he claimed he was, and what he claimed he could do, and in so doing, they forfeited their eternal salvation. If I did not do among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin. But now they have both seen and have hated both me and my Father. So because they were in love with their sin, and it blinded them from recognizing the Father in the form of his Son in their midst, they had forfeited that there's no such thing as winding the clock back and getting a do-over in sin. So once they would have no sin, or it would be expunged and fully repented of and atoned for and forgiven at this point if they had came to the conviction, which even the awareness of whether they recognized it or not, that Elohim was speaking to him in the form of his Son, they chose to persist in their sin, and in so doing forfeited the relationship which can lift them from earth to heaven and from the grave and hell. But that the word might be filled, which was written in their Torah, they hated me without a cause. He's quoting two locations in the Psalm, the 39th and the 69th chapters, I believe. I'm not going to guarantee the accuracy of that, but those are the numbers which are most familiar. And he was hated without a cause. They thought he posed a threat. They imagined he posed a threat. He didn't. The Jews thought that they had to sacrifice him in order that their nation could live. They knew he was. They ascribed to him almost magical powers of troublemaking, and he did stir controversy and perhaps emotional reactions. But he did not pose the threat to Rome, because he did not come as the Messiah who would liberate them from their immediate oppressors, but came to die for their sins to save them from death and hell and judgment. And they all hated him, so it was really without a cause. They did not even understand. They hated what they could not understand, and because they did not understand it, they did not know that there was really no reason to hate who it was they hated. But and when the Helper comes, whom I shall send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who comes from the Father, he shall bear witness of me. So this is, remember, a farewell address. These are his final words in the flesh, pre-resurrected, pre-cross, pre-crucified, except I do believe he does charge John with being the son of Mary. John alone of the apostles was with him to the tail end of the crucifixion. More to the point of the passage, the Spirit is clearly denoted here, as well as several other locations in the Upper Room Discourse, 14:17 and 14:26. And 14:17 he's also likened to the Spirit of truth and the Helper, alternately translated as the Comforter or the Advocate. From these combined offices, we understand that the Spirit's ministry, he ministers to the head, Spirit of truth, and ministers to the heart. He's our helper and comforter and advocate whenever we need him. And the way he testifies of the truth is reminding them of what they had heard from him. So even though he would no longer be with them, in some sense, he would be more real and present to them in the form of the Spirit, which could visit them at all times in all locations and enable these mediocre, unlettered, unschooled fishermen, ordinary, obscure disciples, into the most effective evangelist who ever lived. But you also bear witness, because you have been with me from the beginning. So these disciples, this was the tail end of a 3-year ministry. So from the beginning, his ministry really begins with the choosing of the 12, and because they had been from the beginning, he said that they would already know this and bear witness, but just in case they forgot or needed to, maybe a new believer who had not walked with them in his physical presence would need to know the truth that he expressed and embodied. And they would have the reference point of being with him to know that what the Spirit said came from, agreed with, aligned with, and pointed to the one who is speaking in their midst right now. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. Bye-bye.